Your stomach stopped growling 3 days ago. Now it just burns with a hollow pain that never goes away, like acid eating through your insides. You weigh 90 pounds, down from 170 when you entered Stalingrad 5 months ago. Your uniform hangs on your skeletal frame like cloth draped over a scarecrow. In your hands you hold what passes for breakfast, a slice of bread mixed with sawdust, so hard you need to soak it in melted snow before your teeth can break it apart. Yesterday, you watched Private Weber die quietly in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to weeks of consuming fewer than 200 calories per day. By evening, someone had taken his boots and eaten his remaining rations. You are trapped in the Stalingrad pocket with 300,000 German soldiers, slowly starving to death while Soviet forces tighten the noose around your dying army. The Luftwaffe promised daily supply drops. The trains of food and ammunition never come. Each dawn brings the same question. Will you die from a Russian bullet, or will hunger finish you first? Welcome to history's most horrific example of an army literally consuming itself to survive, where men became walking skeletons who forgot how to be human. November 23, 1942. Operation Uranus begins. Soviet forces launched the largest encirclement operation in military history, with 1.1 million troops attacking the flanks of Army Group Dawn in a pincer movement designed to trap the entire German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. Within 4 days, the trap snaps shut. General Friedrich Paulus and 300,000 German soldiers find themselves surrounded in a pocket measuring roughly 30 miles by 20 miles, cut off from all supply lines and facing a Soviet army determined to destroy them completely. Hitler's response dooms the trapped army before the first shot of the siege is fired. Instead of authorizing a breakout attempt while German forces retain mobility and strength, the Führer orders Paulus to hold position at all costs. The 6th Army will fight where it stands, supplied by air, until relief forces can break through Soviet lines. It's a decision that transforms military defeat into humanitarian catastrophe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring promises that the Luftwaffe can deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, enough to sustain combat operations indefinitely. The reality proves catastrophically different. German transport aircraft face Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and winter weather that makes flying nearly impossible. On good days, perhaps 100 tons reach the trapped army. On most days, nothing arrives at all. The mathematics of starvation become grimly apparent as supply calculations reveal the scope of the disaster. 300,000 soldiers require a minimum of 750 tons of food daily for basic survival. 7 times what the Luftwaffe can deliver, even under ideal conditions. Medical supplies, ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing compete for space on aircraft that barely function in temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Soviet forces systematically tighten the noose around the German pocket, capturing airfields and reducing the area available for supply drops. Each lost airstrip increases the distance transport aircraft must fly, while decreasing the landing zones where supplies can be delivered. The pocket shrinks week by week, concentrating more starving soldiers into smaller areas where they compete for inadequate resources. The strategic situation becomes hopeless as relief efforts fail repeatedly against strengthened Soviet defenses. Operation Winter Storm, launched in December 1942, advances to within 30 miles of the pocket before stalling against determined resistance. No other relief attempts come close to breaking through. The 6th Army faces the simple reality that rescue will not come, surrender is forbidden, and death by starvation has become mathematically inevitable. Inside the pocket, 300,000 men begin the slow process of starving to death, while their government debates political solutions to problems that require only food. Life in the Stalingrad pocket revolves around the daily bread ration, a measurement that determines whether you live another day or begin the final slide toward death. The official allocation starts at 600 grams per soldier in November, drops to 300 grams by December, and reaches 150 grams by January, barely enough to sustain a sedentary civilian, let alone soldiers fighting in sub-zero temperatures while carrying equipment and weapons. Your living environment defies every human need for warmth, shelter, and sanitation. Soldiers dig bunkers in frozen earth using bayonets and spoons, creating cave-like shelters that offer minimal protection from winds that reach 60 miles per hour. Multiple men share body heat in spaces designed for one person, leading to rapid spread of typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections that kill weakened bodies with ruthless efficiency. The bread itself becomes a currency more valuable than German marks or military decorations. Baked from a mixture of grain, sawdust, and cellulose, it has the texture of cardboard and roughly the same nutritional value. Soldiers learn to eat it slowly, soaking each piece in melted snow to make the portions seem larger and last longer. Some men save their daily ration for evening, creating the illusion of a meal. Others devour it immediately, unable to resist the gnawing hunger that consumes rational thought. Food distribution creates hierarchies based on proximity to death rather than military rank. Kitchen workers control access to soup that contains more water than nutrients. Medical orderlies distribute the extra rations supposedly reserved for wounded soldiers. Company clerks manage the lists that determine who receives bread and who doesn't. Power flows to anyone who controls even minimal food resources, creating corruption systems where survival depends on connections rather than courage. Foraging becomes a deadly game of chance played across battlefields littered with frozen corpses. Soldiers risk sniper fire to search dead bodies for hidden food, personal rations, or anything organic that might provide calories. Tree bark gets stripped and boiled into soup. Leather belts and boots become emergency food sources when nothing else remains available. Some units resort to butchering horses killed by artillery fire, though cooking meat requires fuel that doesn't exist. Personal hygiene becomes impossible and irrelevant as bodies shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy for basic survival. Soldiers stop shaving, washing, or changing clothes because these activities require energy better spent staying alive. Lice multiply rapidly in unwashed uniforms, spreading typhus through overcrowded bunkers where sick men have no choice but to sleep inches from healthy ones. The cold compounds starvation by forcing bodies to burn more calories, maintaining core temperature. Soldiers wrapped in inadequate winter clothing lose heat faster than their reduced caloric intake can replace it. Frostbite claims fingers, toes, and ears, while victims lack the energy to prevent circulation loss. Many men die in their sleep as their metabolisms simply stop functioning in temperatures their weakened bodies cannot survive. Military discipline gradually collapses as hunger overrides training, ideology, and fear of punishment. Soldiers abandon posts to search for food. Officers lose authority when they cannot provide the basic necessity that keeps men alive. Units fragment as individuals prioritize personal survival over collective objectives that no longer seem achievable or relevant. Death by starvation follows a predictable timeline that medical officers learn to recognize but cannot prevent. The human body systematically shuts down non-essential functions as it cannibalizes itself to maintain basic life processes, creating a hierarchy of organ failure that turns living soldiers into walking corpses who remain conscious until the final stages. Stage 1 hunger brings constant preoccupation with food that dominates every thought and conversation. Soldiers dream about meals from their childhood, describe elaborate fantasies about post-war dinners, and develop obsessive behaviors around their meager rations. Weight loss begins immediately as the body burns fat reserves, but mental function remains largely intact. This stage lasts approximately 3 weeks on Stalingrad-level rations. Stage 2 starvation attacks muscle mass as fat reserves disappear completely. Soldiers lose 40 to 60 pounds while their bodies consume protein from muscles to maintain blood glucose levels necessary for brain function. Physical strength deteriorates rapidly, making basic military tasks impossible. Men struggle to carry weapons, dig defensive positions, or walk extended distances. Mental concentration becomes difficult as blood sugar instability affects cognitive performance. Stage 3 brings the visible signs that horrify even hardened combat veterans. Soldiers develop the skeletal appearance that defines images of Stalingrad: sunken cheeks, protruding ribs, arms that look like sticks with skin stretched over them. Hair falls out, teeth loosen, and wounds refuse to heal because the body lacks resources for tissue repair. Most critically, the immune system fails completely, leaving starving men vulnerable to diseases that healthy bodies would easily fight off. Disease spreads through starving units like wildfire through dry grass. Typhus, carried by lice that thrive in unwashed clothing, kills thousands of soldiers whose weakened immune systems cannot mount effective resistance. Dysentery turns the simplest meal into a life-threatening experience as digestive systems damaged by prolonged hunger cannot process even minimal nutrition. Pneumonia and tuberculosis claim victims whose respiratory systems lack the energy to clear infected fluid from their lungs. Scurvy appears within weeks as vitamin C deficiency causes teeth to fall out, wounds to reopen, and blood vessels to rupture under the skin. Soldiers develop the telltale signs: black teeth, bleeding gums, and skin that bruises from the slightest contact. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency makes soldiers helpless in darkness, while neurological problems from B vitamin deficiency cause tremors, confusion, and personality changes. The psychological toll proves as devastating as physical breakdown. Hunger psychosis creates hallucinations about food, paranoid delusions about hidden rations, and violent behavior toward anyone suspected of hoarding supplies. Some soldiers develop obsessive-compulsive disorders related to their meager food portions, counting and recounting calories while performing elaborate rituals around eating that consume hours of precious time. Mental deterioration follows predictable patterns as brain function deteriorates from glucose deprivation. Soldiers lose the ability to make rational decisions, often abandoning warm shelters to wander in blizzards while searching for imaginary food sources. Memory fails as the brain cannibalizes its own tissue to maintain basic life functions. Many men forget their families, their homes, and sometimes even their own names. Cannibalism emerges as the ultimate taboo that starvation forces some soldiers to cross. While German military records suppress most documentation, survivor accounts describe desperate men eating the flesh of dead comrades to survive another day. The practice creates psychological trauma that proves worse than physical starvation. The knowledge that civilized human beings can be reduced to consuming other humans for survival. Equipment failures compound survival challenges as starving soldiers lack energy to maintain weapons, communications gear, and heating systems that might improve their chances. Rifles freeze because men cannot perform maintenance requiring fine motor control they no longer possess. Radio operators fall asleep at their posts because their brains cannot maintain alertness on starvation rations. Vehicle drivers crash because hunger-induced hallucinations distort their perception of reality. Medical facilities become death houses where wounded soldiers compete with starving men for resources that don't exist. Army doctors perform surgery without anesthesia because medical supplies arrive sporadically or not at all. Infected wounds become fatal because antibiotics are unavailable, and immune systems cannot fight off bacteria. Simple injuries that would heal easily under normal conditions become death sentences for men whose bodies lack the raw materials necessary for tissue repair. Perhaps most cruel is the false hope created by occasional supply drops that deliver enough food for one decent meal among thousands of starving soldiers. These sporadic deliveries create feeding frenzies where desperate men fight each other for scraps, often resulting in injuries and deaths over portions that wouldn't satisfy a child's appetite. The mathematics prove unforgiving. 300,000 soldiers consuming 150 grams of bread daily will begin dying en masse within 6 weeks. Individual variations in body fat, metabolism, and cold exposure affect the timeline, but the outcome remains mathematically certain without adequate nutrition. December 24th, 1942. Christmas Eve in Hell. You are Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner with the 24th Panzer Division, celebrating Christmas with a feast that consists of 100 grams of bread, a cup of watery soup made from horse bones, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted grain. Around you, what remains of your company, 23 men out of the original 180, huddle in a bunker carved from frozen rubble, singing Silent Night, with voices weakened by 8 weeks of systematic starvation. The Christmas celebration marks the moment when even the most optimistic soldiers realize that rescue will not come. Supply drops that were supposed to increase for the holiday deliver nothing except Soviet artillery shells aimed at the transport aircraft that never arrive.
The Luftwaffe promises are revealed as lies told by leaders who prioritize political propaganda over the lives of men dying in their frozen holes. Your company commander, Hauptmann Müller, reads a letter from the Führer promising that heroic sacrifice will be remembered forever by the German people, but the words ring hollow when spoken by an officer who weighs 85 pounds and can barely stand without support. The gap between Nazi rhetoric and the reality of soldiers eating tree bark has become too wide for ideology to bridge. The Christmas rations represent the last attempt to maintain morale through symbolic gestures that cannot address physical reality. Each man receives an extra 50 grams of bread, barely 2 bites, along with a cigarette that most soldiers trade for food because hunger has eliminated the desire for anything except calories. The special meal tastes exactly like every other meal, sawdust mixed with flour and seasoned with desperation. During the night, Private Hartmann dies quietly in his sleep, becoming the 157th member of your original company to succumb to starvation, disease, or wounds that wouldn't heal. By morning, someone has removed his boots, coat, and food ration, while his body remains warm. The Christmas spirit extends only as far as survival instincts allow. The breakdown of military hierarchy accelerates as hunger eliminates the social bonds that hold armies together. Officers can no longer maintain discipline when they cannot provide the basic necessity that keeps soldiers alive. Enlisted men ignore orders from superiors who look like walking skeletons. Unit cohesion dissolves as individuals focus entirely on personal survival rather than collective military objectives. Supply distribution becomes a feeding frenzy that resembles animal behavior more than human organization. When a single transport plane manages to drop containers into the pocket, thousands of starving soldiers converge on the supplies like scavengers fighting over carrion. Men who were friends hours earlier attack each other with bayonets over single cans of meat that wouldn't satisfy a peacetime appetite. The psychological breaking point arrives when soldiers realize that their government has abandoned them to die for strategic objectives that no longer exist. Radio broadcasts from Berlin continue promising relief and reinforcement while men watch their comrades starve to death in numbers that exceed combat casualties. The disconnect between propaganda and reality destroys whatever faith remained in Nazi leadership. Medical reports paint a picture of systematic human destruction that defies military comprehension. Of the 300,000 soldiers trapped in the pocket, fewer than 150,000 remain capable of military action by Christmas. The rest are too weak to fight, too sick to recover, or already dead from causes that would be preventable with adequate nutrition and medical supplies. The Christmas offensive launched by Soviet forces reveals the tactical implications of mass starvation. German defensive positions crumble not because of superior Soviet tactics, but because starving soldiers lack the strength to operate weapons, man positions, or conduct basic military functions. Machine gunners collapse at their posts. Artillery crews cannot lift shells. Infantry units simply melt away as individuals wander off in search of food. The final German counterattack fails catastrophically when assault troops advance 200 yards before exhaustion forces them to halt. Men trained for mobile warfare discover they cannot run, cannot carry equipment, and cannot maintain the physical exertion that combat requires. The attack dissolves into a line of soldiers lying in the snow, gasping for breath they don't have the strength to draw. By December 31st, the 6th Army exists primarily on paper rather than battlefield reality. Unit designations persist in staff reports, but the soldiers those units represent have become walking skeletons who pose no meaningful threat to Soviet forces. The Christmas that was supposed to bring German victory instead marks the beginning of the final collapse. The new year arrives with the mathematical certainty that most of the men celebrating it will be dead within weeks, not from enemy action, but from the simple biological fact that human beings cannot survive indefinitely on 150 grams of bread per day. The numbers tell a story more devastating than any battlefield defeat in military history. Of the 300,000 German soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, fewer than 90,000 survived to surrender on February 2, 1943. More critically, starvation and disease kill more soldiers than Soviet bullets. An estimated 150,000 men die from hunger-related causes, while only 60,000 fall to enemy action. The 6th Army literally consumes itself to death over 76 days of encirclement. The survivors who march into Soviet captivity represent walking testaments to human endurance under impossible conditions. Weighing an average of 80 pounds, these skeletal figures can barely walk the distances required to reach prisoner of war camps. Soviet medical personnel, themselves familiar with starvation from the siege of Leningrad, express shock at the physical condition of German prisoners who appear more dead than alive. Of the 90,000 men who enter Soviet captivity, fewer than 5,000 ever return to Germany. Most die within weeks of surrender as their bodies, weakened beyond recovery, cannot process the increased nutrition available in prison camps. Others succumb to diseases that their immune systems, destroyed by months of starvation, cannot fight. The mortality rate among Stalingrad prisoners exceeds 95%, higher than any other group of German POWs in Soviet custody. "We weren't soldiers anymore by the end," wrote survivor Joachim Wieder in his memoir. "We were walking corpses who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The hunger made animals of us all, animals who would do anything for one more day of life, even when life had ceased to have meaning." The strategic impact extends far beyond the tactical defeat at Stalingrad. German military doctrine undergoes fundamental revision to emphasize supply security and logistics planning that prevents armies from becoming trapped without adequate provisioning. The concept of fortress cities that can be sustained by airlift alone proves to be a deadly fantasy that costs hundreds of thousands of lives. Modern military logistics incorporates lessons learned from the Stalingrad disaster about the mathematical requirements for sustaining large forces in isolated positions. Military planners understand that air supply cannot replace ground transportation for anything beyond short-term emergency situations. The 500-ton daily requirement promised by Göring becomes a case study in logistical impossibility that influences military education for generations. The medical legacy revolutionizes understanding of starvation physiology and the timeline of human deterioration under extreme nutritional stress. Military medicine develops protocols for treating starvation victims that prove applicable in subsequent conflicts and humanitarian crises. The systematic documentation of hunger's effects on military effectiveness influences both tactical doctrine and rules of engagement regarding siege warfare. Perhaps most significantly, Stalingrad demonstrates the ultimate failure of ideological commitment to overcome physical reality. Nazi propaganda could not feed starving soldiers. Party loyalty could not generate calories from empty stomachs, and political willpower could not sustain armies without adequate supply lines. The siege establishes precedents for international law regarding the treatment of encircled forces and civilian populations, contributing to Geneva Convention revisions that address the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war. Today, military professionals study Stalingrad as the definitive example of how logistics determines military outcomes more than courage, training, or ideological commitment. The lesson remains relevant. Armies march on their stomachs, and when the food runs out, even the finest soldiers become ineffective regardless of their willingness to fight and die for their cause. The next time you skip a meal, remember the soldiers who measured their remaining life in grams of bread mixed with sawdust. When you complain about hunger after a few hours without food, think about men who spent months watching their bodies consume themselves while their leaders promised relief that never came. Somewhere in Russian soil, the bones of 150,000 German soldiers rest where they fell, not to enemy bullets, but to the simple mathematics of human biology that no amount of courage or ideology can overcome. They died because politicians made promises that physics could not keep, because air transport could not replace ground supply, and because human beings cannot survive on empty stomachs no matter how strong their will to fight. Their fate reminds us that all military might, no matter how powerful or well-trained, depends on the most basic of human needs: food. Technology advances, weapons improve, tactics evolve, but soldiers still march on their stomachs, and when the supply lines break, even the finest armies become walking skeletons counting down to death. At Stalingrad, 300,000 men learned that hunger is the ultimate enemy, one that cannot be shot, bombed, or defeated through force of will. It can only be fed.